My name is Elena Vasquez, and before the world shut down in 2020, my life felt like it was running on autopilot. I was 34, living in Chicago, and stuck in a job that drained me. As an administrative assistant in a corporate office, my days were filled with answering emails, organizing schedules, and making coffee runs for my boss, who barely acknowledged my existence. It wasn't a bad job, per se, it paid my bills, but it certainly wasn't fulfilling. Every morning, I dragged myself out of bed, took the crowded train downtown, and counted down the hours until I could go home and binge-watch TV. For years, I convinced myself this was just how life worked. Dreams were for people with time and energy, two things I never seemed to have. My days blurred into each other, my nights were spent scrolling through social media, watching other people travel, start businesses, or create something meaningful. I told myself I should be grateful. I had a stable job, an apartment, and health insurance. But deep down, I felt stagnant, like there was more inside of me, but I had no idea how to access it. Socially, I wasn't much better off. Most of my friendships had faded into occasional texts, and my love life was non-existent. It wasn't that I didn't want connection, I did, but I felt invisible. I watched my coworkers effortlessly chat with strangers at happy hours while I stayed in the background, sipping a cocktail and pretending to be engrossed in my phone. I blamed my lack of confidence on my upbringing. My parents were loving but practical, firm believers in security over passion. My father worked in construction, my mother was a nurse, and both instilled in me the idea that dreams weren't practical. Do something safe, they'd always said. Something with benefits. So I did. I went to college, got a business degree, and landed a steady job. But steady didn't mean happy. Then, the pandemic hit. At first, I thought it would last 2 weeks. Like everyone else, I stocked up on groceries and hunkered down in my tiny apartment. But as the weeks dragged into months, the isolation set in. My office went remote, and while some of my coworkers enjoyed the change, I hated it. Without the structure of commuting and office interactions, I felt untethered. I struggled to focus, my anxiety spiked, and the loneliness became unbearable. Every night, I sat in front of my laptop, watching the news. Rising case numbers. Overwhelmed hospitals. People losing their jobs. I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had no real purpose. If the world was falling apart, what had I even contributed to it? The thought made me spiral. One night, feeling particularly lost, I opened my laptop and started writing. I had no plan, no agenda, just an overwhelming need to get my thoughts out of my head. The words spilled out, my frustrations, my fears, the things I had never dared to say out loud. It wasn't polished or structured, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than numbness. I told myself it was a one-time thing. But the next night, I did it again. And again. Writing became my ritual. Every evening, I'd pour myself a glass of wine, open my laptop, and let the words flow. I wrote about my childhood, my regrets, my longing for something more. I wrote imaginary dialogues between the person I was and the person I wished I could be. At first, I kept it all to myself. But as weeks passed, I started reading about writing. I found online communities of people just like me, people who had always wanted to create but never dared to try. I lurked in forums, too scared to post anything of my own. Then, one night, I did something that terrified me. I posted a short personal essay, just a raw, unfiltered piece about loneliness during the pandemic, on a public forum. I hovered over the delete button, my heart racing. But before I could take it down, the comments started rolling in. People related to it. Strangers were telling me that my words had moved them, that they felt seen. One person messaged me privately to say my post had helped them feel less alone. I stared at my screen, overwhelmed. I had spent my entire life believing I had no real talent. That I was just another ordinary person, stuck in an ordinary life. But in that moment, I realized something. I had a voice. And people wanted to hear it. That night, for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of excitement. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to stop writing. I had found something inside of me that I never knew existed. And I wasn't about to let it go. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Writing had cracked something open inside of me, something I hadn't even realized was locked away. But excitement alone wasn't enough. Doubt still lurked in the back of my mind, whispering that this was a temporary distraction, that I wasn't really a writer, that sooner or later, I'd run out of words. Every time I posted something, I agonized over it, hovering over the delete button, second-guessing every sentence. What if no one cares? What if I sound stupid? My inner critic was relentless. But despite the fear, I kept going. At first, I stuck to personal essays, short reflections on the strange, suspended reality of lockdown. I wrote about loneliness, about watching the world from behind a screen, about the quiet ache of missing things I had once taken for granted. To my surprise, people responded. Strangers on the internet told me they felt the same way. Some even shared their own stories, and for the first time in months, I felt a connection, even in isolation. The encouragement was a spark, but soon, doubt crept back in. Was that all I had? How many times could I write about the same emotions before they became repetitive? What if I ran out of things to say? One night, after aimlessly scrolling through writing forums, I stumbled upon a group focused on fiction. I had always assumed fiction writing was for real writers, people with degrees in literature, people who spent their childhood scribbling stories in notebooks, people with actual talent. But something about it intrigued me. Writing personal essays felt cathartic, but fiction offered something else: escape. A chance to step outside my own life, to create something entirely new. The idea rattled around in my head for days before I finally worked up the nerve to try. I sat down at my laptop, fingers hovering over the keys, my mind blank. Where did stories come from? How did people just make things up? I felt ridiculous, completely out of my depth. The first story I wrote was awful. Truly, painfully awful. The plot made no sense, the dialogue was clunky, the characters felt flat. I hated every word. But somehow, I finished it. And even though it was terrible, I felt a flicker of pride. I had done something I had never done before. Terrified but curious, I posted it in a small online writing group, half expecting silence, or worse, brutal criticism. My heart pounded as I refreshed the page, waiting for someone to confirm my worst fears: "You're not a writer. Stick to your day job." Instead, people responded. They didn't tear me apart. In fact, some even found things they liked about it. "Your writing feels alive," one person commented. "You should keep going." I read those words at least 10 times. That tiny bit of validation ignited something in me. I kept writing, pushing myself to create new stories, even when the doubt crept in. At first, I mimicked the styles of authors I admired, borrowing their voices like a child trying on costumes. But over time, my writing started to feel more mine. I wrote about women breaking free from expectations, about love and loss, about all the emotions I had bottled up for years. The more I wrote, the more I realized something profound: I had always been a storyteller. I just never had the courage to embrace it. Of course, the journey wasn't smooth. Some nights, I stared at the blinking cursor, convinced I had nothing worthwhile to say. The voice of my parents echoed in my mind: "Writing isn't a real job. You're wasting your time." Every rejection stung, each one feeling like proof that I wasn't good enough. I saw other writers getting published, building careers, and I felt like an imposter. But I refused to stop. I started submitting short stories to online literary magazines, even though I braced myself for rejection. And at first, that's exactly what happened. The polite, generic, "We regret to inform you." Emails filled my inbox, each one feeling like a punch to the gut. But over time, I stopped seeing them as failures. Rejections meant I was trying. And trying was more than I had ever done before. Then, one morning in late September, everything changed. I was half-heartedly checking my email, expecting another rejection, when I saw it, an acceptance letter. My breath caught in my throat. I had to reread it 3 times before it sank in. A small but respected online magazine wanted to publish one of my short stories. My story. My hands were shaking. Tears blurred my vision. It was a small accomplishment, just one story in one magazine, but to me, it meant everything. For the first time in my life, someone outside of my tiny corner of the world had read my words and decided they were good enough. I sat on my couch for nearly an hour, staring at the email, letting it sink in. I wasn't just a person dabbling in writing anymore. I was a writer. That realization changed everything. For years, I had been playing it safe, staying in a job that drained me because it was stable. But now, I saw things differently. I didn't want to spend my life waiting for the weekends, dreading Monday mornings. I wanted to wake up excited. I wanted to create. So I made a bold decision. I started researching freelance writing opportunities, diving into blog writing, copywriting, and content creation. I had no idea if I could make a living from it, but for the first time, I was willing to try. I spent hours learning, building a portfolio, reaching out to potential clients. By December, I had landed my first paid gig, writing blog posts for a small business. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but it was proof that I could do this. That I could make money with my words. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally stepping into the person I was always meant to be. The day my first paid writing gig went live, I refreshed the website at least 20 times. Seeing my name attached to something that someone had paid me to create felt surreal. It wasn't a best-selling novel, and it wasn't an article in the New York Times, but it was proof that my words had value. That I had value. I wish I could say that from that moment on, everything was easy, that I quit my job, became a full-time writer overnight, and lived happily ever after. But real transformation doesn't work like that. Growth is messy. There were days I felt unstoppable, and days I questioned everything. I took on low-paying gigs, struggled to set boundaries, and battled imposter syndrome at every turn. But I was doing it. By early 2021, my freelance work had grown enough that I faced a terrifying decision: stay in my safe but soul-crushing job, or take a leap of faith. I turned in my resignation. When I told my parents, their reaction was predictable. My dad asked if I had lost my mind. My mom, ever the practical one, begged me to reconsider. "Writing isn't a real job, Elena," she said, concern heavy in her voice. "What if you fail?" I thought about that for a long time. What if I did fail? What if this was a mistake? But then I thought about the version of myself who had spent years sitting in a cubicle, suffocating under the weight of unrealized potential. That was already failure. Staying in a life that didn't fulfill me just because it was safe, that was the real mistake. So I told her the truth: I'd rather fail at something I love than succeed at something that makes me miserable. She didn't understand. But for the first time in my life, I didn't need her to. The first few months were terrifying. Freelancing was unpredictable, and some weeks, I barely made enough to cover rent. I worked late nights, took on projects I wasn't passionate about, and dealt with clients who undervalued my work. But every time I thought about giving up, I reminded myself, I chose this. And that choice mattered. Little by little, things started changing. More clients came in. I raised my rates. I built a portfolio I was proud of. And then, the thing I had secretly dreamed of but never thought possible actually happened. An editor from a mid-sized digital publication reached out to me. She had read one of my personal essays and wanted to commission a piece. It was my first big break, and when the article went live, it took off in a way I never expected. People commented. They shared their own experiences. They told me my words made them feel seen. That's when it truly hit me. This wasn't just about writing. This was about connection. About giving people the words they couldn't always find for themselves. About being the voice I had once so desperately needed. By the end of 2021, my life looked completely different. I had steady clients, a growing audience, and, most importantly, a sense of purpose I had never known before. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was creating. And yet, every now and then, I'd have a quiet moment where I'd think back to the woman I used to be, the one who sat in a tiny apartment during lockdown, convinced she had nothing special to offer the world. If I could go back and tell her anything, it would be this: you are more than your job title. More than your fears. More than the limits you've placed on yourself. The life you want is possible, but you have to be brave enough to step into it. So, to anyone reading this who feels stuck, uninspired, or unsure of what comes next, this is your sign. Your talent, your passion, your purpose is there. Maybe you haven't found it yet, or maybe it's been whispering to you for years, waiting for you to listen. The world needs what only you can create. So tell me, what's stopping you?